Excellent. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the Talk to Danielle podcast. I am your host, Danielle C. Baker. And before we get started, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe to whichever channel you're listening and watching from. And today I'm really excited because I do have a returning guest. For those of you who did get to watch her episode not too long ago, I have Dr. Norrine Russell with me, a wonderful coach for neurodivergent children, something that we need so much more of to get that additional support and just resources and tools and tips of the realities of raising neurodivergent children, especially with ADHD or autism, any kind of challenges where your child doesn't fit the box. And I'm so excited to have Norrine back on because today we are going to be talking about the realities parents have to face with the initial shock of saying, okay, my child is not going to fix that box. And what does that look like? Not just for yourself as a parent with all the guilt and remorse and uh, everything, the fears that come along, but also with the extended family and the struggles you may face with this, the kind of the stigma behind it and the lack of knowledge or lack of education on the conditions and those kind of wars. So I'm going to jump right in and thank you so much, Norrine, for joining me. I'm really excited to have you on.
Danielle, I'm so honored to be back. Thank you. This is such an important topic too, because I think this is where parents really don't know, and they don't get a lot of advice or help from other professionals on what to do in the beginning and with extended family. So I think it's wonderful that you're dedicating a show to this.
Yeah, and it's something that I've experienced professionally and personally as well. Is we talk a lot about having the diagnosis, getting the diagnosis, but there's not and then you're just kind of thrown with a bunch of different links that you can refer to or people you can refer to, but there's not that conversation to say, okay, you get the support you need. We kind of try to internalize this and think that we have to do it on our own, and we really don't. But there's that stigma of saying, I don't really want to talk about it. I don't want to tag my child to walk around with a label, so there's all that. So let's just jump right in. I mean, for those who didn't listen to the conversation earlier, the other episode, can you kind of talk about your background and the work that you do in this field?
Sure, absolutely. I have a PhD in psychology and have worked in academia, teaching at different colleges and universities. I have been an executive director of a nonprofit dedicated to youth development, and currently, for the last 16 years, have been building a student and parent coaching practice. We primarily work with students who are neurodiverse, and they're quite bright. They have the potential to do well in school and in life, but they're missing some of those executive functioning skills, some of those life skills. And so what we do at Russell Coaching is help students build the executive functioning skills that they need to be successful. And we primarily work with middle school through college age students. We do also do some parent coaching, primarily again for parents who have children who have some kind of neurodevelopmental diagnoses, and they're generally at the beginning of receiving that diagnosis and figuring out where to go with the diagnosis. So that's what I do full time, is Russell Coaching, academic and ADHD coaching for students.
No, it's amazing. It's a lot of work, and you get to see, like, you're right in it. And that kind of leads to that first question. Let's just start right from the beginning, and just to kind of give that normalcy for people to not think that they're alone going through it. And what is generally kind of the reaction parents will have when they with the reality that their child could possibly have ADHD or any other kind of diagnosis?
I'm so glad we're starting here, because I think there is a missing message out there. And really, when we start at the very beginning, and I think you'll have some listeners who are in this place and you're thinking, does my child need an evaluation? Is this quote unquote behavior linked to the teacher, the school, the classroom, my own parenting strategies, there's this very beginning phase of the dawning of, oh, is there something truly, in quotes, different with my child? And that stage of realization can take several months. Sometimes it can take a few years. And so, what I really want to say to parents is try to be curious rather than afraid. Of course, it's natural to be afraid, and you don't have to be unafraid, right? But the more curious you are, the more you can seek input from teachers, former teachers, after school directors, coaches, the better informed you're going to be about, okay, so is my child demonstrating something that is concerning enough, different enough, unusual enough that we should get an evaluation? And then that leads into a whole separate question of, okay, who do we see for an ADHD evaluation? But in that beginning stage of the realization, I think it's most important to try to be curious and non-judgmental about your child and yourself, Danielle.
Yeah, that's so true. And I see it from the early childhood education side of things, where as educators, we start noticing some little red flags in the developmental stages, but it's so difficult because every child develops at their own rate in their own way. And so it's still kind of that question mark of, is this something we should start questioning, or is that just part of the development? And to keep that conversation open with a parent is a sensitive topic. We don't want to uh, we don't want to come across as we're attacking the family, to say we're noticing some things, referring back to the specialists that could help. But it is, like you say, it could take months, it could take years, and if the parents are open to it as well. So that kind of is the thing too, from your experience. Uh, would there commonly be one parent that's more open to having the start the evaluation process? And for what you've noticed, is that common to have just the one parent?
I think it's very common to have one parent who is more open to it or feels less judged by it. I want to quickly comment on something you said, because as parents are getting this information, and if they are called into a conference at school or they're getting feedback from a teacher, whether it's at the early childhood level or elementary or middle school, sometimes we have these old beliefs that are not really accurate most of the time, that, oh, school just wants them to behave. School wants them to fit in a box. The teacher just wants him on meds so her life is easier. And I've actually never run across a teacher who has a conference with parents to say, can you get this kid evaluated so my life is easier? And I think that that's something we can all do, whether you're listening as a parent of a child who you think, oh, maybe we need an evaluation, or you're listening and you're thinking, oh, my friend had that conference. What could I say or do, right? I think we really want to have a stronger message in the professional community. When teachers at any level give that feedback, they're doing it because they've seen hundreds of students over the years. They're not diagnosing. What they're sharing with you are their observations and their concerns, and they're making a recommendation that you get an evaluation. And so I really hope that anyone who's listening can, in their own mind, integrate that message. Teachers are doing this because they care and because they have a perspective that we never have as parents, right? They've seen hundreds of children and they know what are some signs that could be red flags. So I think that's really important to note. And then, yes, usually there's one parent who's a little more open to things. I think sometimes there is a parent who has ADHD who feels a little bit defensive, or, maybe even subconsciously, is this quote unquote my fault, which it's nobody's fault, right? It's a
Yeah.
neurodevelopmental, primarily genetic disorder. I think that as a parent, if you have ADHD and you were successful without a school plan or without treatment, sometimes it's also easy to feel like, well, I did it and I turned out just fine. And so we don't need to go through any of this, extra accommodations or extra help. I'm doing just fine. And when I work with parents and parent coaching on that, what I try to say is, yes, absolutely, you did. You did great, right? And that's maybe the path that will happen for your child. But let's maximize the chances that that will help, that will happen for your child by giving them the help that they need and that they're legally entitled to in school. So
Yeah.
I think it's a little harder for dads sometimes. And I think it's a little harder for the parent who has ADHD sometimes, whether that's mom or dad. And sometimes that difference can get resolved sort of quickly through a good conversation or two with a clinician. And sometimes it lasts, for years in the child's maturation years. I think the important thing is to try as hard as possible to find some middle ground. Maybe someone believes, oh, ADHD is just a myth, and someone else believes, nope, it's a scientific diagnosis. Okay, let's look at what your child needs to thrive.
Yes. That is so important to look at it and taking our own personal um, fears and thoughts aside. We want the best for our child, and that's what schools do. I really like the fact that you brought that up because I've seen it as well, where yes, teachers do see the behaviors with hundreds and hundreds of students every year, but they also see how your child is struggling in class, and that's painful to watch. You are not going to see that at home where they're alone or with a couple of siblings that you can kind of move around in the house, but sitting at a table or a desk for 6.5 hours a day with 30 other children with all these distractions, the teachers are seeing your child's struggle, and it does help. And just another note from my own experience is pushing medication just to keep the children calm. If they don't have the diagnosis, that medication doesn't work. So let's put that out there as well. We know when you have a real diagnosis and you take that, you notice already just in the child's body language, they're so much calmer, more at peace. They're not struggling, and that's what we want for them. So again, I'm not a medication pusher, but I've seen the difference in a classroom setting. We'll talk about medication a little bit later, but I wanted to put it out there. And there's also the fact that there's usually, yes, parents will think it's their fault or will refuse to face the reality of it, especially when parents are separated. If they're not together and they're already in conflict between each other, that tends to fuel up the conflict sometimes. So is there a way that parents could work together? Or how can parents learn to work together if they have different ideas of what ADHD is? You've mentioned it's a myth, it's scientific. How can they work together for the best for their child and kind of put their ego and pride aside?
Yeah. One of the things that I think is most helpful is for parents to have a consultation with their clinician, whoever that is. Did the pediatrician diagnose? Did they have a full, psychoeducational evaluation? Is there a therapist on board? For parents to schedule either together or individually some time with a clinician to learn more. And I think what we would want to encourage parents to say is, what do I need to know about ADHD, right? What do most parents not commonly understand about ADHD? What would you tell parents who are really struggling with this diagnosis and accepting it on the part of their child? And I think that's valuable because then you can become educated and you can experience some really important listening from the therapist or the psychologist about how you're feeling. We need to process this experience as parents. My children have multiple diagnoses, and as we received each one, there were some that I had more grieving feelings toward. There were some that I had exasperation about. There were some that I was genuinely angry about. But I think that we are most able to move forward with scientifically based treatment and kind of removing it from that personal place of ego or pride or misinformation once we've processed our feelings. So my most important suggestion there is take some time to have someone listen to you and your feelings as a parent, and then provide you with up-to-date neurodevelopmental information about ADHD, because you know and I know that this is still referred to as a behavior disorder, which really leads people to think it's a behavior disorder. The child could control it if they wanted to. And as parents, we need to be much better informed about really what are the symptoms of ADHD and how do those manifest. So that's my perspective on what to do. And then if there's conflict, if the parents are separated, sometimes having those conversations individually, but then either parent can take the lead and say, okay, so let's take a look at what are the recommended treatments, not what do you believe, but what are the recommended treatments for ADHD and where do we want to go? And again, I think if this is a bone of contention between parents, have that conversation with the clinician who diagnosed or the clinician who's treating your child. We don't have to go this alone.
Yes, that's so true. And that's the message I try to keep pushing is you don't have to go through this alone. And there is a lot of support that you can find. You just have to be open to it. And that's I think, one of the struggles. I like, because I actually got that from you, and that's the term that I'm using now is symptoms, not behavior. The child is not showing behavior issues, they're showing symptoms of what they have. And so discipline is completely different. How do you handle the symptoms versus how do you handle a behavior? The strategies are not the same at all. If you have a child who's having an anaphylactic reaction, and can't breathe, you're not going to treat it as asthma, So it's the same for discipline when you start looking at it as this is the symptoms of their condition. This is the symptoms of what they have, for the ADHD, autism, whichever diagnosis you received, could be anxiety. What are the effective ways of discipline? Again, it wouldn't be discipline, it would kind of be your procedure. Yeah, it's like, exactly. So what are the effective ways of handling ADHD? Let's say, because I think that's one of the most common ones that we get is for ADHD.
Yeah. Right. And I think one common idea still culturally is kids with ADHD need more discipline. And this comes from seeing that they are impulsive, that they're not focusing where they should be. They're not getting their schoolwork done. They're not cleaning up their room. They're not remembering to put their shoes on. They're not remembering to unpack their lunch. They're impulsively poking their sister or their brother. They're throwing things. And all of those things look like, to the uninformed, behaviors, right? The child is disrespectful. The child, is being disobedient. The child is being cantankerous. The child needs a nap, whatever it is. Once there is a scientific diagnosis of ADHD, then we need to put on a different set of glasses, right? We need to understand that these are not behavior choices that the child is making, but that they are symptoms of ADHD. And so while it is just as maddening and frustrating and annoying, even as a parent or any member of the extended family, I think what needs to happen is a shift from consequences-based parenting to strategy and skill-based parenting, right? So when we're dealing with a child who's needs to modify some behaviors. We know that praise and behavior modification is extremely effective, right? And we can use some of that with ADHD kids. Great job. Let's, really make them feel good about the fact that they got their homework done today, or they were able to, on the car ride home, keep their hands to themselves. But we also very much need to be teaching kids with ADHD skills and strategies. What do you do with your hands when you feel antsy? What can you actually do? Do you have a fidget toy? Can you sit on them? Can you press them on the desk? Can you hold onto your seatbelt when you're in the car, right? We need to understand that these are neurological symptoms of ADHD and quit saying, you need to stop doing that. You need to stop doing that. You need to try harder, right? We would never give that advice to a child who is having, an asthma attack or an anaphylactic, attack. We would say, oh, this is a medical problem that requires treatment. And so it's difficult, right? Because we don't always know, looking at the child, is that particular day and time and event directed by ADHD, or is that just kind of like an overtired 7-year-old or a adolescent 13-year-old? But you can never go wrong as a parent teaching strategies and skills for self-regulation.
Yeah.
You can go wrong with punishment.
There's yes, there's a lot to that with the punishment. We can talk about that a little bit more, but I like that you mentioned that this is why it's so important to get the support and help that as much as you can, because you've mentioned that in our first episode together was you were having moments with your teenagers where you could actually stop and think, wait, that's not an ADHD related thing. That's a teenager thing. That's like a normal developmental stage of being a teenager. And so you're so caught up in the symptoms that you have to deal with on a daily that sometimes you're just like, wait a minute. And my child is just being a 7-year-old boy who needs to jump around a little bit. And so it's important to see that. And that's why disciplining does come. And it goes even further for me. And it kind of leads me to I want to get your take on that one because meltdowns, restraint, collapse, there's meltdowns and there's also shutdowns where your child completely disconnects or disassociates, which can be just as worrying. But what is your advice on parents handling stress when you're raising a child with ADHD or autism or any other type of neurodivergent condition?
I think it is so important for us as parents and adults to acknowledge this is really hard. If you take a look at what we know about raising a child with ADHD, it is one of the most stressful conditions a child can have in terms of the parent response. And so it's very easy for us to think, oh, ADHD, they just have a little hard time getting their work done in school, or, they're a little, extra wiggly. But ADHD can be a very difficult condition to parent and stressful. And you can feel very ineffective as a parent. And of course, that feels terrible, right? And so I think the first step is kind of making peace with the fact that this is hard. And this is harder than a lot of people in my network are going to understand. And then I think the second step is to figure out who in your network of neighbors, friends, extended family, brother, sister, sister-in-law might be open to learning a little bit about ADHD and providing you with some support. Like, okay, so there are some things that I'd like you to know. For me, that person has been my college roommate. Her name is Beth. She has totally kept up with my kids. We don't live in the same town. She knows what their diagnoses are. She understands what it's like to parent them. She never makes comparisons between her neurotypical children and my atypical children. And she has gone so far as to help me take my son on trips. And she's not an autism mom. She's not an ADHD mom. And she's just been very open to learning. So I think, tell yourself that this is going to be stressful. And then B, figure out who in your circle can offer you some support. And then, of course, the third thing is ask for support when you need it. Today's been a hard day. Today has just been a really awful Tuesday. I feel ineffective. I'm super frustrated. I feel really angry that she behaved like this while I was trying to get through the grocery store, and ask for help when you need it. And then don't beat yourself up that you asked for help.
Yes. My goodness, is that ever so important that it's not, you can't do it alone. It's normal to ask for help. Even with parents with neurotypical children, they do need the help. You do need to take care of yourself so you can take care of your child as well. So it's so important. Yeah, you need to find that, at least that one person. I've worked with so many families who were afraid. They didn't want to go out. They didn't want to leave their child with somebody because they didn't know how the child was going to react. And you can find people that are going to make your child feel at ease, or at least want to know, okay, what can I do? What will trigger them? What will, and so it's so important to find it. And there are around. You just have to ask. You really just have to ask.
And if you have grandparents or extended family that want to help with childcare, that want you as, the mom or the dad or parents to be able to have a day out or a night out, it's really okay to say, I really appreciate that you want to help, and I want to accept your help. And do you have maybe 15 or 20 minutes where we could really talk through where Mason or Mary is at right now with their ADHD? Because I want you to know what to expect, and I want you to know what works for Mason or Mary or whoever it is, right? And so, this isn't the norm, right? The norm is, oh, grandparents, well, they've raised kids already. They can come over and watch the sweet grandkids, and, everyone will have a great time, and grandma will give them candy, and, it's all good. But it's okay if it doesn't look like that. It's okay if you as a parent needs to say, listen, I want this to go smoothly, and I understand that we just have an extra dynamic here. And so could we spend some time talking about that? We have to, as parents, get to a place where we don't buy into the stigma, because you're not helping your child or yourself if you get stuck in the stigma.
Yes, that's such a good point. I didn't think of it that way, but yes, to have that conversation too kind of puts it on the person who's offering to help to say, there's a difference here that we need to talk about. And you're setting your boundaries. We'll talk about the extended family and how to help educate them on that as well, because those who are going through it understand there's quite a difference of opinions and how you should raise your child and all of that. But before we get into it, I'd like to take it just a little step further into the teen years, where you've talked a little bit earlier, if disciplining or supporting the child is not handled properly. Um, and the punishments, if we can say, uh, can lead to some erratic behaviors or more aggressive behaviors in the teen years. And one of them is just to self-medicate. They're going through so much. They've gone through some trauma. I can honestly say that in school and with other interactions, uh, and they just need to that feel, they feel that they need to numb themselves, and the impulsivity of their conditions can also lead to these um, bad habits. So, what is the best way parents can keep an open dialogue with their teens about ADHD and drugs and alcohol and any other bad habits? Because it can go into gambling, and it doesn't have to be, but it's still very negative effect on them. How can the parents keep that open dialogue with their teens?
Yeah. This is so, so very important for parents to be aware of. And the first thing I want to say is this is one of the benefits of early evaluation and early treatment, because addressing this in the elementary school years and your child having an age appropriate understanding of ADHD and knowing how their brain works as they go from elementary to middle to high school is so much easier than getting an ADHD diagnosis at 16 or 17. So Parents who are thinking, do I need an evaluation? Is it just the teacher? Get the evaluation, figure it out. Just like we do if we're not sure if a bone is broken or a kid needs glasses, right? Go get the evaluation. I think the other piece as we move into the actual teenage years is, again, times have changed. What professionals and experts recommend is open conversations with your teenager, as opposed to kind of laying down the law. You won't drink or smoke or vape or do anything like that as long as you're under my roof, right?
Yeah.
The opposite is not helpful either. Like, well, if they're doing it at home, that's fine. What we need to do for specifically our kids with ADHD is educate them about the effect of vaping, drugs, alcohol on their ADHD brain. Because not unsurprisingly, if they experiment with those things, they will find, oh, I do feel differently. Several years ago, I had a family whose son started vaping nicotine in school. And he had had a level of ADHD that was hard to get under control. And he said, it's not so much that I wanted to be vaping or that I was okay with vaping, but it finally was the first time that I felt like the edge was taken off and that I really could focus and get my work done. And I said to the parents, yes, of course, we don't want the solution to be vaping nicotine. And yes, we need to go back to the doctor and address that. But kudos to your son for recognizing that that's what he was going after and that that's how it was affecting his brain, right? And I think in large part, he was able to do that because his parents had always been very open about ADHD, what it feels like, what the symptoms are. And so just as if we have a child with diabetes, we would have some specific conversations about alcohol and diabetes and blood sugar, we need to do the same for our early adolescents, our middle adolescents, and our young adults around drugs and alcohol. This is how this could impact you as a person with ADHD. And then we know, of course, 2/3 of people with ADHD also have something else going on. So if you have a kid with ADHD and anxiety or depression and anxiety or autism, we have to really lay out what is that going to look like. And of course, if there's a family history of addiction, you need to lay that out. So I think having science-based conversations about how does the ADHD brain process drugs and alcohol? What is that likely to do for you? And then saying to your teenager, I do understand that there's a lot of experimentation out there. And if at some point you make the decision to experiment, please know that I would rather you talk to me about that than not. And yes, I might have my own feelings of anger or disappointment, but my primary job is going to be to help you figure out how to stay healthy. Right. And I think it's important to acknowledge both reactions are going to be there, right? You're not going to say to your 15-year-old, because they're not going to buy it, I won't be mad. Just tell me if you got drunk, right? No, you can say, I might have some feelings about that, but my primary focus is going to be on helping you stay healthy and safe. And so I'm not going to let my feelings get in the way of that.
I like that. I really like that approach. And also just to put the focus on the ADHD brain, because the teens are impressionable with their friends. They're really peer oriented. So if they watch their friends get drunk at a party, okay, but they will not have that won't have the same effect on them as they will on themselves. So it's so important giving the facts as opposed to being a parent, but just to give them the bare facts. It also helps them later on when they're on their own, independent, and they can kind of remember that they won't react the same way as a neurotypical brain would. That's so important.
And we have to talk with them about impulsivity, right? Impulsivity ramps up in all adolescents. And then you have a neurodevelopmental disorder where impulsivity is one of the 3 core symptoms. So at times you are going to experience really strong impulses, and that might be around drugs and alcohol. It might not be, but if it is, then we need to talk about how you can stay healthy and safe, because I don't want you impulsively having a 12-pack of beer the first time you have a beer, you know? We have to talk about the impulsivity as part of the neurological makeup. And so I think that also helps parents to move out of the kind of crack down, emotionally driven parenting messages.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so true. Yeah, because the emotions are not, it's not the thing that's going to pop up when you're in that impulsive mode. And it's not that one sip. Oh, it's just a sip. That's not just a sip for that one individual, or it's just a puff. It's not a puff for that one individual. That'll be, yeah, that will be their life for a while. So no, that's so important. So I just kind of thank you for sharing that, because I think it's very important. We spend a lot of time on the schooling and academic side of things, but there's that social side of things too that we kind of shy away from as topics that people don't necessarily want to talk about. We need to put it out there. Uh, I want to get back to the extended family, because I think that's one of the harshest realities, where those are the ones that you expect to be able to support you. And everybody has a wide range of opinions on the condition that are not necessarily science-based. So how can parents handle that, especially when they express, grandma, grandpa, auntie, uncle, who start expressing their opinions on their child's condition, and they're not necessarily helpful or kind. So how could they handle that without causing
Yeah.
drama in the family?
This is another area where, quite frankly, it's hard for parents, but it is the parent's responsibility. It is. It's just, this is what's been handed to you. And so starting those conversations and saying, you know, I totally get, or my wife and I, my husband and I totally get that there are a lot of ideas about ADHD that are out there in our culture. We'd like to share with you some of what we've learned about ADHD, a lot of which surprised us. And I want you to kind of understand what our parenting philosophy is, so that when we're at grandma's, or when we're at a big holiday, event, or when we're at the family reunion, and you see us doing things that might look like tolerating behaviors or not
Mhm.
punishing behaviors, you can really understand where we're coming from. Because, and I think we empathize here, because I can see where it would look like maybe we're letting our child get away with things, or we're not disciplining correctly. And so, if you have time to go to lunch or have a phone call, we'd like to let you know a little bit about what we've learned. It's really great if that conversation can happen after the diagnosis, but before the big family blow up, right? Like,
Right.
oh, something significant has happened in our family this month. Annie has received a diagnosis of ADHD, kind of threw us for a loop. We want to share with you what we've learned, because family is important to us. And so, here are 3 things that we've learned that we'd like to share with you, because family is important. We want to be able to spend time together. And we realize that there's a lot of misinformation out there in the culture. I think
Yeah.
the important aspect of this conversation is to say, 1, we've learned stuff, right? 2, it's easy to see why people don't know stuff. And 3, we want you to know because we love you and we want to stay in relationship with you.
Right. Yeah, that's an important conversation to have. And are there any specific resources that are geared for families, especially for grandparents, and how can parents share that information or resources with them that would help them out?
I think some of the best resources, I'm going to give you 3, are those that are short and to the point and easily digestible. And Attitude Magazine online is one of the best for that. They have things that are really one page on the website that are easy to digest. So attitudemag.com is great. And because it's completely about ADHD, you can look up ADHD in elementary school, ADHD and stress,
Mhm.
ADHD and, discipline. And they have thousands of articles. So you really can drill down into if there's something that's really bothering grandma, or there's something that's really bothering your sister, let's find an article and share it. Hey, want to make sure that we do our share as parents in helping you understand our child who we know you love. Here's a great article from Attitude Magazine that I found helpful, right? You're never preaching, you're never judging, you're never demanding, right? You're sharing out of love.
Yeah.
AttitudeMag.com is a great one. CHADD, which is CHADD, children and adults with ADHD, CHADD, they have a lot of articles. They tend to be a little bit more in depth. So if you've read kind of the one pager and you're looking for more in-depth information, CHADD is a great place. And then if you have a child with ADHD who also has another neurodevelopmental or psychiatric condition, I think childmind.org is a great organization full of parent and family resources for your child who has ADHD and anxiety, for your child who has ADHD and autism. And so those are the three that I generally send people to. The internet is full of misinformation about ADHD. It just really is. And so it's super important to not Google ADHD. Let's go directly to high quality, scientifically oriented sources, not do a general Google search.
Yes, that's the message that really needs to get across is we all know that we shouldn't be is it Google you just looking for the proof that will prove your point of view on ADHD. So going to trusted and mindful resources, I think, are great. And I'm going to add those three resources to the description. So anybody who wants to check them out, you can definitely have a look at those. They're very helpful. And it's just to open up the conversation with the family is so important. And so that kind of helps with what, especially grandparents, because I think those are the ones that we kind of think about for, like you said, the kids can hang out at the grandparents' house, get all the candy they want, eat cake for breakfast, get away with everything. But it's the resources that grandparents need to have. More importantly, because of the generational wars, I guess I could say, in terms of parenting, how can we approach the whole disciplining, like because of the symptoms in ADHD specifically, or autism with meltdowns or anxiety attacks, they'll say, well, you're just spoiling them, you need to be hard, toughen them up. Does more discipline actually solve ADHD in your opinion?
No, and in almost every way, if not every way, it makes it worse. And we, as the go-between between our parents and our kids, again, have to take that responsibility on. And I think it's best done with empathy and grace.
Yeah.
Our parents did the best they could do. There was an entirely different approach to parenting. We are in the midst of a parenting revolution, even for typical kids. The way that parenting is framed and discussed and the types of parenting that are advocated are so different than what was happening when we were getting brought up. And so you then layer on an issue that is a mental health issue and how much things have changed when it comes to mental health. Of course, it's understandable that our parents, grandparents might think, oh, well, more punishment, more discipline, and that child will sit still at the dinner table. Or, well, I would be giving that child a good spanking, or that wouldn't fly in my house. And I don't think initially there's any reason to take a defensive attitude if we can approach it with empathy and grace and understand that many grandparents, not all grandparents, and we want to acknowledge that, but many grandparents are doing their best to try to be helpful. And we have a perfect right as our children's parents to set some boundaries around that, right?
Yeah.
So it's not fruitful to allow the dynamics to keep going on and then being mad behind closed doors, and then it impacts the relationship, and you don't want your kid hanging out with grandma or grandpa, or every time they do, you feel exhausted for 3 days. That's not okay. It's not okay because the parent already has a huge amount of work that comes from raising a child with ADHD. So, and I also don't think it's very fruitful to have those conversations in the moment, right? So if my son, Ethan, is having, a complete meltdown because he has both ADHD and autism, this is not the time to try to explain to my mom or dad, this is what's going on. And, I'm just going to let him be for the next 30 to 45 minutes while his brain calms down. And then he may or may not remember some of it. We're going to process it a little bit later. In the moment is never going to be helpful to engage others in a deeper understanding, right? That has to happen offline at a quiet time. The same way we do with our spouses if we're in a marriage or a significant relationship, right? We know that screaming and shouting in the midst of the conflict doesn't help. We know it has to go offline when our brains are cool. Same thing is true with grandparents. If they're saying things that you disagree with, if they're saying things that are upsetting you, if they're saying things that indicate that they don't know, that they don't understand, while your child is being impulsive or hyperactive or melting down or shutting down, we got to have that conversation later in the week.
Yeah, that is so true. And it's hard because there's the respect your parent side of things that we were raised with as well. So um yeah, waiting for the storm to calm down first of all is so important. And as also for the child, because the child know that there's something and that they're being judged, and the discipline can also just tell them that they're bad children. So it would be like for a neurodivergent child, that would be like saying to a child in a wheelchair that they are bad kids because they can't walk. So it's just telling them to calm down, telling them that they're manipulating the parents. That is traumatizing for the child. It really thinks that there's something wrong with them when there isn't. It's just the way that they're wired. Um, you were talking about the big family blowout, and you were talking about setting those boundaries. What or how can parents set those boundaries, especially with the parents or uncles, aunties, if they feel unsupported or if they're actually seeing that it's doing damage to their child, or it's not a healthy relationship for their child? That can be tough to cut people out of your life. So how do you set those boundaries as easily as possible, or as less chaotic as possible?
It is tough. It genuinely is tough. And I think that's why it's so important to have those initial conversations, to invite people to come on board. And then sometimes, right, we need to set smaller, lower boundaries. No, actually, it's okay. I brought the chicken tenders and the white rice that he likes, so I'm going to allow him to eat this. I understand you've made a really beautiful holiday meal, and I appreciate that, and I'm going to enjoy it. But we are going to let, our son have the foods that he's comfortable with, because we want him to be here and we want him to be participating in family. And now is not the time to fight the battle about food. We can also do things like set parameters on how long we stay. Understand that, you're having Christmas all day at your house. We're going to open presents at our house first, and then we're going to be able to come over for whatever it is, 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, right? We can figure out what works for our child and convey that ahead of time, right? We're going to be arriving late. We're going to be leaving early. We're going to allow him his headset. We're going to allow him to be listening to music. We're going to allow him to take a 15-minute break and have some TV time before dinner time, right? So there's all these kind of little boundaries that are really just setting up behavior expectations and supporting your child that can happen. If it gets to the point where family members are refusing to accept those boundaries or continuing to be disrespectful with their words, like, oh, she just thinks he has ADHD, or, well, his dad just lets him get away with everything because he has, in quotes, ADHD, right? Then I think we have to talk more about how do we limit our time and the child's time with that family member. And that's okay. If people are not able to be part of our healthy support circle, you can take a break for a while. You can take a break for a short while, a long while. You can take a break until that person, is able to meet you and support
Yeah.
you. Um, it's not healthy to continue to expose yourself to something that is incredibly stressful that you have no power or agency over. And you feel like you're going to go to Thanksgiving at grandma's and everyone's going to talk about how your child is the wild child, right? That's not healthy for anyone. And we did that for many generations, but the time really is now to
Yeah.
not do that.
No, it's so important. And you're right to set that boundary of time because we could stay longer, but then we'll have a meltdown. And now everybody's going to say that the child ruined the holidays. Well, why don't we just take him home before we get there? It's just, you
Right.
know, it kind of works that better that way. So, and I think it's so important because it's teaching your child how they can set boundaries in their future relationships, whether they're business relationships or personal relationships, friendships, when they're on their own, they'll be able to, because then, when you've grown up being told that there's something wrong with you, um, the people pleasing part, the masking, it gets higher and higher. So to be able to set those healthy boundaries for yourself so you don't drain yourself as an adult, I think it's also very important. It's a lot to take it. I could talk to you about this all day, but it gives us a really great overview of the realities that parents, children with ADHD or any neurodivergent child could go through, and to have that conversation so that the parents who are going through it realize that they're not alone, that they're heard, that there is a support system out there. It may not be the one that they expected, but there are a lot of people that are even strangers will be willing to help you more than who you thought was going to be there for you. So um, ask for that help, take care of yourself, and set those boundaries. You know what works for you and your child, and the right people in your life will respect those boundaries and those conditions. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your expertise on this. And I will add those resources on there. And how can people reach you? Because you do this, this is your practice. You help, especially with the transition from teens to adults. We spend so much time on our children when they're in school, but we need to prepare them for that world so that they don't fall into those impulsivities and everything else. So how can people reach you, and what kind of programs do you offer so people can contact you directly if they wanted to work with you?
Danielle, first of all, thank you for having me back on the podcast. You are addressing such important topics, and it's really just my pleasure and my honor to come on and have conversations with you and talk about how can parents think about ADHD and how can they think about ditching the stigma and adopting a proactive advocacy approach. So thank you for having me on.
Thank you.
And for those who are listening who think, oh, well, we might be able to use some of that help, we can be found at russellcoaching.com. We do offer student coaching for students from middle school through college. It may or may not surprise some of your listeners to know that half of first-year college students are not successful.
Yeah.
And so when we have all these supports in place in high school, and then we think, okay, we're going to send them off to college and let's see if they can do it.
Mhm.
Let's send them off to college first year with some supports, some scaffolding, and then think about how do we dial that down. So that's
Yeah.
one of the areas of specialization we have at Russell Coaching, is helping students make that transition from middle school to high school, and then from high school to young adulthood, whether that's college or the full-time work world. So once you go to russellcoaching.com, you'll be able to follow us on socials. You'll be able to take a look at the podcasts that I have been a guest on, as well as the podcast that I host. And hopefully we can be a resource for families who are looking for information. There's an place to sign up for a complimentary call with me directly on our website, and happy to do that with any of your listeners.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. And again, I just appreciate you coming on and sharing this information, because it's important to have a variety of different resources, and you have so a wealth of it. So I really appreciate you coming on, and I know I'm going to have you on again. There's so many other topics we could talk about on this. So I'm looking forward to having you on again.
Thank you.
Thank you. For everybody watching, don't forget to go and check Dr. Russell's website. It's russellcoaching.com. And don't forget to look in the description for those great resources that she's given us. And don't forget to follow her as well. And don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe to whichever channel you're listening or watching from. And until next time, stay safe, stay awesome, and we'll talk soon.